the person who sees to it will be able to understand very much clearly, pretty much clearly, that this is what the logic of the code is doing. The comments are written for the purpose of making it understandable to other person who wants to go through the code segment. A web page is very important, through which he can understand what actually the code segment is performing. Code must be readable and understandable, which is done in the form of a comments and documentation. So we have a documentation tools. Hello and warm welcome to one and all. It is Dr. Ravikumar YB, Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram, First Grade College, MYSURU, the Temple of Excellence. In today's session, you will be taught about the code documentation tools. In my previous sessions, I was talking about the design documentation tools, which is the next step, coding. What is the documentation? External documentation and internal documentation are certain types of documentations that is done at the time of coding as well. So let us discuss about the code documentation tools. While writing the software code documentation, it is important to consider the code documentation tool required for writing the software code. What is that tool? Which is that tool? The software documentation tools conform to the standards by generating the required elements automatically with configurable format and style. These tools combine the selected comment sections with the software code to generate usable documentation with the essential level of details in it. What does this mean? These three paragraphs together, we shall summarize the entire slide as: some of the tools are used here to generate a documentation for a code segment. If I have a comments in my program, that has to be brought up in the form of documentation, so that a Java doc, Python doc is a documentation tools we use there to generate a code segment, the description of the code segment, so that the person who sees to it will be able to understand very much clearly, pretty much clearly, that this is what the logic of the code is doing, so that the other person who wants to enhance the functionality of that can do it so easily. So if I see that the documentation tools used in C++ are Cocoon, CC doc in C++, doc++ in Java, C++. We have Java doc in Java, as I told you right now, Perceps in C++, and CXref in C. These are the different types of documentation tools, and the languages which supports the documentation tools, the types of documentation tools are mentioned there. So these are just the information related to the documentation tool names in that respective languages, programming language. So moving on forward, we have RoboDoc in many other languages like COBOL, scripts, Fortran, Shell, Lisp, and assembler, C, Perl kind of language. If I look at the programming languages like also called Java, C, C++, Visual Basic, we have DocJet. We have Object Manual in C++, together in Java and C++, Doc-O-Matic in C++, C#, ASP.NET, and the .NET framework. So let me describe about the code documentation tools now. Code documentation tools should be simple to use, because easy to use documentation tools provide rapid feedback. However, the basic feature of the software code documentation tools are listed below. Let me show in the next slide. Here, the first list is target media. That means views software code easily in a web browser. The target media is useful in displaying the structure and layout of the page with sufficient precision. Precise information, accurate information is needed. It is required for code documentation so that the software code can be easily used in the web browser. As I told you in the previous session, that is, a web page is very important through which he can understand what actually the code segment is performing, so that the person who wants to use it, if he is interested to know more about the code segment or the functionality of a code segment, he can learn so through the web pages designed for him with the help of documentation, that is software documentation tools can be usually used in the browser. An example of a target media is HTML or text files. Second one is documentation structure, which includes the index pages and chapters. As you have already seen the chapters or books, where you will find that the index content. What is the particular chapter and what is the functionality of that chapter and which is that page number relevant and related to that particular chapter can be found there in the form of index. So all these indexes or the documentation structures are maintained. The chapters documentation should include the information such as introduction, title, table of contents and section. The same thing here. Comment extraction. Comment extraction capabilities extracts the software code comments regardless of the style used in the software code. As I have already told you in the previous session, the comments are written for the purpose of making it understandable to other person who wants to go through the code segment. Suppose if any other person, a non-technical person who wants to go through the code segment or who wants to learn about it or who wants to know about it, then he can do so. He can learn so with the help of documentation which is done in the form of HTML files or text files. Then languages supported, because I have already discussed with you that different languages supports different types of Java documentation. That means different types of documentation tools. That makes the code documentation consistent while writing the software code. That means the code documentation tools support multiple programming languages and are preferred for concentrating on a particular language. Formatting and styled elements. Make the format of the software code proper so that special elements like tags, markups are required to determine the layout, structure and style of the code documentation. We have already discussed the information that is HTML file is generated and how these HTML files are generated with the help of the tags. We have already seen that HTML tags, that is title, head of the HTML, body of the HTML file and all those things. We also have gone through the XML file, that is extensible markup language, that helps us to highlight a particular paragraph which is very, very important for the users. All those things can be done in the form of the documentation structure with the help of tags and markups. Then code readability. Makes the software code consistent and easily readable. This is because code documentation is itself not sufficient and requires the comments in the software code to make the code documentation readable and understandable. The same thing I explained earlier. That means code must be readable and understandable, which is done in the form of a comments and documentation. So we have a documentation tools. In addition to the above mentioned features, the amount of detail provided is also an important feature. Too much detail makes the code documentation inefficient and proves unnecessary. That means that is not at all required. Only few of the important informations are made and furnished in the form of the documents. The level of details should be according to the software developer and not accounting to the coding tools used in the software code. That has to be noticed here. So we have these kind of information in the form of documentation tools. These documentation tools helps us to retain few of the information which are essentially required and which is useful for the programmer or to the client or to the person who wants to understand the code segment. So these kind of documentation tools are used here. So stop today's session here. Thank you very much. Thank you one and all.